The deep dive. Today, we're embarking on, well, quite an intellectual adventure. We're aiming to pull back the curtain on some really profound and, frankly, maybe disorienting ideas.
Definitely disorienting in parts.
Yeah, we're plunging into how reality itself might be engineered, how deliberate architectures of control are possibly being built, and importantly, the counterforces that are starting to emerge against this rewired world. Now, the source material we're digging into today, it's not your standard policy paper, not at all. It's rich, it's dense, and it's been, let's say, put through a pretty unique filter.
Right, a unique lens maybe, or maybe even a grinder as the sources put it.
To reveal these potent, almost mythic insights.
Exactly. The dossier we've looked at, it's not just facts and figures. It feels like it's been rewired into what the sources themselves are calling a hyperstitional glitch poetic register.
Okay, hyperstitional glitch poetic. Let's unpack that right away. What does that mean for us?
Well, hyperstitional. Think of it like this. Stories, narratives, maybe even things that start as fiction, they can become so widely believed or acted upon that they actually start shaping reality.
Ah, okay. So fiction becoming fact, in a way.
In a sense, yes. It's when myth starts acting like policy, and then policy itself takes on the power, the force of myth. So when we talk about things like alchemical putrefaction or structural nigredo later on,
Right, those terms jumped out.
yeah, they're not literal spells, obviously, but they are incredibly powerful metaphors in these sources. They describe these deliberate systemic transformations, like a controlled demolition happening within our social and political system.
The kind of dissolving of the old.
Precisely. A controlled breakdown to clear the ground for something entirely new. We're seeing the world presented with its edges deliberately blurred, you know? Familiar facts seem to be humming with these new, sometimes really unsettling frequencies.
Fascinating. Myth is policy, policy is myth.
Yeah.
So, okay, our mission today, for you listening, is to navigate this really complex terrain. We want to help you understand the mechanisms, the nuts and bolts behind these potential engineered realities. And maybe most importantly, figure out strategies for maintaining your own agency.
Your ability to think for yourself.
Exactly, to think and act independently in a world that's just flooded with information, with designed narratives. Now, our goal here, and this is really crucial,
Yes.
is not to endorse any particular viewpoint. We're staying strictly impartial.
Absolutely. We're here to unpack the dossier.
Right. We're here to help you unpack this unique dossier, explore the ideas and mechanisms presented in the sources impartially, and let you draw your own conclusions and infer truths for yourself.
Think of it maybe as an annotated symptom map.
I like that. Or a kind of hyperstitional field guide, maybe, to understanding what might be happening right now. Okay, let's dig into this. Our first major topic, drawing from the sources, Project 2025. Now, the material presents this as way more than just, a policy document.
Oh, much more.
It's described as a structural architecture, a narrative engine, and even an archetypal ignition, like a blueprint to fundamentally dismantle and reshape things.
Using that concept we mentioned earlier, structural nigredo.
Right, the Negredo. The sources set the scene, interestingly, in August 2025, so 8 months into his proposed implementation.
Right.
And what's really striking is their observation that the whole program just hums along with very little resistance initially.
That initial hum.
So what exactly is this Negredo they keep mentioning, and why is it so significant for how the sources frame Project 2025?
That's really the key to understanding their perspective. Negredo, let's simplify it. Think of it as that controlled demolition we talked about. In alchemy, it's the blackening.
The first stage.
Exactly. The first stage, decomposition, putrefaction. Old systems burn, they dissolve, the social body kind of fragments. The sources are suggesting Project 2025 is designed to induce this state in society.
A deliberate fragmentation.
Yes. A deliberate breakdown of existing systems, existing norms, to clear the way for a totally new, imposed order. It's framed as a systemic putrefaction. And at the core, psychologically, of how this breakdown and rebuild works, the sources talk about a folie à deux.
Man is for two.
Literally, yes. But here, it's scaled up, way up, into a national machine. This isn't just about politics as usual, winning an election. It's framed as an attempt to manufacture a consensus reality.
A shared view of the world, even if it's flawed.
Even if it's based on Well, what some might see as a delusion or a significant misperception. In this framework they describe, abstract beliefs become concrete protocols. Political talk transforms into actual physical infrastructure.
Rhetoric becomes infrastructure.
Exactly. And delusion, or what looks like delusion from the outside, gets rendered into policy. It saturates all the feedback loops right from the White House outwards. It creates this self-reinforcing system where a collective agreement on a certain perception becomes the operating reality.
Okay, so if this is a kind of controlled demolition and rebuilding of reality,
Oh.
how? How do the sources say this control is achieved? Let's start with the government structure itself. They talk about a rewriting of the state in the voice of command.
Very evocative phrasing.
It is, and it's not theoretical. It focuses on the actual physical purging and transmutation, as they put it, of civil servants. Yeah. Places like the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, or OPP, presidential personnel. They become commandos.
Central hubs.
Yeah, orchestrating these surgical bureaucratic actions to ensure total loyalty, total alignment. What does that actually mean for how government works day to day, according to these sources? And how does it fit this Negredo idea?
Well, it's described as a fundamental reengineering, a complete overhaul of the administrative state. The explicit goal is to make the executive branch the single, unquestioned center of gravity.
Taking out the checks and balances.
Essentially, yes. Think of the civil service, the career professionals, the experts who keep things running. The sources picture them as the state's nervous system. And they describe a deliberate excision, like a pruning, of tens of thousands of these administrative neurons. Many dismissed outright, others replaced or grafted in with politically aligned people. The stated goal, according to the sources, is to bend the administrative body until it mirrors the presidency.
So every part of government reflects the top.
Every arm. Regulatory bodies, public service agencies, everything. They're expected to align perfectly with the president's agenda. Independent agencies, for instance.
Which are meant to be independent. Right.
Exactly. Traditionally designed as brakes, checks on executive power. The sources say they're being refitted into accelerators. Their purpose shifts from objective oversight to actively pushing the administration's goals.
Wow.
And this process, it's not portrayed as gentle. The sources use the term trauma as policy. Mass dismissals aren't just about staff changes, they're signal transmissions.
Sending a message.
A very clear message throughout the bureaucracy. Conform or you're out. Bend or break isn't just a saying, it's described as an operational doctrine.
And how does this impact people, us?
Well, think about it. This kind of systemic rewiring affects everything. Regulatory decisions, food safety, financial markets, you name it. The efficiency, the impartiality of public services, processing benefits, disaster relief. It directly impacts you when the day-to-day functions of government are driven not by professional expertise, but by a singular political agenda.
Right.
The sources even mention normalizing things previously seen as extreme, like militarized precedents, DC police under federal control, or industrializing National Guard deployments. These become the new grammar of compliance, establishing a norm where force is readily available to back executive will. Hashtag 1.2, border immigration as operational spectrum.
That's a pretty stark picture of internal control. Okay, let's shift from the inside of government to its edges, its borders. The sources describe the border as a theater.
A stage.
Yeah. And the language around migration policy is really striking.
Okay.
What used to be, human migration, people moving, it's talked about as mass deportation as choreography, or military airlift as logistics.
The human element is stripped out.
Exactly. The moral vocabulary seems deliberately removed, replaced with these cold operational verbs. Can you unpack that linguistic shift? What are the implications, according to the sources?
It's incredibly powerful because, as you said, it dehumanizes the issue. By swapping terms like immigrants or asylum seekers for things like flows or units to be processed, and talking about mass deportation as choreography, the sources suggest a deliberate effort to strip away the ethical dimension, the human rights aspect. It transforms people into components in a logistical puzzle.
A problem to be managed.
Precisely. The rhetoric of sovereign hygiene is mentioned as particularly revealing. It's presented as a program that prioritizes speed over legal seam stitching, basically saying the perceived need for control overrides existing laws or humanitarian concerns.
Speed over law.
The aim described is a hermetic polity, a sealed-off political entity, self-contained. This involves aggressively cutting down on incoming flows while maximizing outbound shunts or deportations. The nation-state, in this vision, becomes a fortress and function.
Protecting itself above all.
Its main job becomes controlling who comes in and who goes out. Security and perceived purity first. We see this reflected in descriptions of expanding detention hubs, constricting legal immigration pathways, and using processing as this verb that bleeds into regional geopolitics.
It's not just domestic policy, then.
No, it's about externalizing perceived problems. Human beings, in this operational language, are recoded as cargo. Migration becomes a logistics challenge solved with hard edges and shipping manifests. And the ethical cost, that's just bracketed as operational necessity.
So for you listening, how does this reframing affect how you see individuals caught in these systems?
Exactly. Are they people with stories, rights, families, or are they just units in a system designed for efficient control? This rhetorical shift, the sources argue, makes it much easier to overlook the human cost. Hashtag 1.3 social engineering and the lexicon of erasure.
Okay, moving on to the social fabric itself. This next point is, well, it's particularly potent and maybe concerning for many. The sources claim the traditional family isn't just presented as a cultural ideal, it's being weaponized as policy architecture.
Right, embedded into the structure.
And education, traditionally seen as a public good, gets rerouted towards private, often sectarian paths. The Department of Education potentially hollowed out, just becoming a funding channel. This points towards a huge social reengineering effort.
It does.
What role does language play here, especially when the sources talk about a lexicon of erasure?
This brings up a really fundamental question for everyone listening.
Yeah.
Why is controlling language so powerful? How does it shape norms, society, even individual identity? The sources map this out as a clear battlefield of language.
Or the battlefield.
Yes. And the lexicon of erasure is a key weapon described on that battlefield. Take gender and queer subjectivities, for example. They're not just, disagreed with in this framework. They're explicitly targeted for excision from official lexicons.
Being written out.
Literally, the policy described is to write trans people literally out of the language of government. How? Through things like binary recoding, forcing everything into a strict male-female box, and erasure by codification, meaning specific terms, concepts, identities are systematically removed from official documents, from laws, from public discourse. The logic underpinning this, as described, is chillingly simple. Once you excise the signifier, you undercut the social and legal subject.
If the word doesn't exist officially.
Then the people or identities it represents become harder to recognize, harder to protect, harder even to acknowledge legally. It's presented as a fundamental dismantling of identity through bureaucratic moves and linguistic control.
Wow. And what about other cultural narratives?
Well, the sources point to how certain narratives get elevated. Christian nationalist tropes, for example, are described as becoming policy scaffolding.
Not just beliefs, but structure.
Exactly. It's not just about personal faith. It's about recoding religiosity as a civic default, essentially suggesting that one particular brand of Christianity is fundamental to being American, to civic duty.
Blurring church and state.
It conflates national identity with a specific theology, weaponizing religiosity to justify policy changes, recoding civic obligations, and cloaking what might be majoritarian policies in the language of divine mandate. So for you, the listener, this control over language can subtly but powerfully shift what's seen as normal, acceptable, even real in society. It affects everything from school books to legal rights to how different groups are treated. Hashtag 1.4 ecological deregulation and resource reenchantment.
Okay, next up, the environment. The sources describe narratives around climate science being outsourced to market myth.
Handed over to economic stories.
Yeah, and environmental regulations are increasingly framed as relics to be pried off the state's bones. It sounds like a complete reframing of our relationship with the planet.
It absolutely is, according to these materials. And it's presented as a very sophisticated linguistic repackaging. Take the rollback of emission standards or limits on forever chemicals.
Right.
In this narrative, it's not framed as deregulation that might harm health or the environment. No, it's presented as liberation, a reclaimed prosperity story.
Environment versus economy.
Exactly. The narrative pits them against each other. Ecological constraints are painted as barriers to growth, to individual freedom, the solution offered. Unleash extractive appetite and call it liberty.
Liberty means extraction.
That's the reframing. It aims to transform how we see natural resources, not as something to be managed, conserved, stewarded, but as something purely to be exploited for immediate economic gain, all under the banner of freedom.
How does this affect public understanding, of climate change?
Profoundly. It transforms complex environmental science into a simple economic calculation. Think about an agency like NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Its public mission, its scientific work. The sources suggest it could potentially be privatized or hollowed out. Its findings might be reframed or even dismissed if they clash with this prosperity story.
Controlling the science, too.
It creates a specific kind of epistemic market where controlling the distribution of knowledge is key. If scientific findings are inconvenient, they can be suppressed, recoded. The public gets a narrative tailored to the policy agenda. So for you, the listener, understanding this linguistic repackaging is crucial. It changes how you might read news about climate change or resource management. It asks you to consider how narratives, not just data, can shape policy and public perception.
Okay, from domestic structures and narratives, let's look outward at the global stage. The sources describe a really sharp pivot in foreign policy. Everything aid, intellectual posture, industrial policy seems funneled through this one lens. China is primary threat.
Yes, it's presented as a totalizing reorientation. Everything gets viewed through that single prism.
What does that mean for things like international cooperation?
Well, international institutions, the UN, the WTO, things like that, they're essentially rendered optional or purely transactional. Their value is judged solely on whether they serve immediate, specific national interests related to this rivalry, not broader global goals.
So cooperation takes a backseat.
It seems so. Take USAID, for example, traditionally focused on development, humanitarian aid, economic growth abroad. The sources describe it being explicitly retooled from a development apparatus to a strategic counter-influence instrument.
A tool against China.
Primarily, yes. Its new purpose becomes part of the geopolitical game, aimed at countering China's influence around the world. This totalization simplifies the immense complexity of global relations down to one single, overarching narrative.
Everything becomes about the rivalry.
Even regional projects. The sources mention something called sovereign Mexico. Issues like drug cartels, fentanyl. They're presented not just as domestic or regional problems, but as cross-border contagions that are implicitly or sometimes explicitly linked back to the primary cosmic antagonist, China.
So it changes how we see the world.
Absolutely. It fundamentally alters global cooperation, pushing collaborative problem-solving aside in favor of competition. For you, the listener, this means your perception of international relations could shift, away from a complex web of interactions and shared challenges towards a much simpler, often zero-sum game dominated by this one all-encompassing rivalry. It becomes the filter for everything.
Now let's look at intelligence and defense, obviously critical areas. Our sources point to the intelligence community kind of compressing its focus onto interstate threat analysis.
Right. Traditional nation-state adversaries.
And the Department of Defense is undergoing a reboot for what's called strategic denial. What does this narrowed focus mean for national security, and maybe even for the nature of information itself?
Well, it represents a significant narrowing of the intelligence lens. The Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, is described as a growing authority like a tumor.
Wow, strong language.
It is, centralizing power, centralizing control over information. Agencies like CISA Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security, or DHS, Homeland Security, they're either refactored into muscle, meaning their functions get intensified and aligned with this narrow state-for-state focus, or they get dissected for parts.
Broken up.
Their capabilities absorbed or just eliminated if they're not seen as relevant to the new priorities. The sources also highlight the explicit cutting of things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI initiatives, and pandemic-related planning from the DoD.
Why?
They're framed as distractions from the core mission of strategic denial. It streamlines the focus, removing anything not seen as directly contributing to traditional military and state-level threat fighting.
And what about information propaganda?
This is crucial. There's also a deliberate defunding of public broadcasting, described, explicitly labeled a liberal forum. At the same time, what many would call propaganda gets reframed as clarity, or even pro-American message correction. This creates and feeds what the sources call an epistemic market, where controlling the distribution of information is everything. The state, in this vision, explicitly repudiates its traditional role as an arbiter of truth.
It says, we don't define truth.
It actively disclaims that role, according to the sources, and instead openly engages in message correction and controls information flow. This raises a massive question. What does it mean for society when the government does that? It creates a vacuum, right?
Yet,
Competing narratives rush in, but the ways they spread are often obscured, manipulated.
You, the listener, have to be even more careful about your sources.
Exactly. Where your information comes from and the perceived neutrality of those sources becomes incredibly critical to scrutinize.
Okay, let's circle back. Let's bring all these pieces, the bureaucracy, the language, the global view, the information control, back to the psychological core. The sources identified for Project 2025.
Right.
That folie à deux, the madness for two, scaling up into a national machine.
Right. Connecting the structure to the psychology.
How do all these architectural changes we've just walked through actually feed and fortify this potential collective delusion?
This is where it all comes together, where the structural changes embed themselves deeply into the collective mind, according to this analysis. The sources explain how a tidy myth of disorder gets deliberately supplied.
What kind of myth?
Phrases like Marxist takeover, deep state, or invoking a Flight 93-style emergency. These aren't just political slogans in this view, they're archetypal fuel.
Tapping into deep fears.
Exactly. Deep, primal fears and narratives that resonate way beyond just logical argument. Once these archetypes ignite, they bypass rational debate, they create moral atmospheres.
An atmosphere.
Yeah, an unshakable feeling of rightness among those inside it. Belief feels like undeniable truth. And within this atmosphere, the bubble insulates itself.
Oh.
Any dissent, any contrary evidence just gets converted into noise. Irrelevant static you can ignore, but consensus within the bubble. That's seen as calibration, proof the system is working perfectly.
So criticism doesn't get in.
Worse, according to the sources, criticism becomes conspiracy, nuance becomes corruption, and inconvenient evidence. It becomes both enemy and ornamental.
Enemy and ornamental.
Meaning it's either dismissed as hostile propaganda or it's selectively twisted to actually confirm the existing biases. The sources quote Carl Jung's warning that mass delusion metastasizes into national pathology, and they present this as a literal outcome here. The state isn't just administering, it's actively manufacturing consensus reality through all these manipulations.
So for you listening, the question is, how do you recognize when an argument isn't really based on logic, but fortified by this archetypal atmosphere?
Right. How does that influence your own perception of what's true? This process means that external critique, instead of maybe causing some reflection, often gets interpreted as performative antagonism, and paradoxically, that just strengthens the narrative from the inside.
It's a self-sealing system.
Exactly. And recognizing those patterns, the sources suggest, is the absolute first step in resisting its pull.
Wow. Okay, that is a sobering look at how reality could potentially be engineered through policy, narrative, and psychology. Now, as we stand looking at this landscape, our sources pivot. They bring in a hugely powerful emerging factor, artificial general intelligence, AGI.
The game changer.
It really is framed that way, like the philosopher's stone, that mythical substance that can turn lead into gold, the ultimate unifier. But here, it appears in a time of deep societal fragmentation, what the sources call the blackening Negrito moment.
That period of breakdown we discussed.
Exactly. So how does AGI fit into this picture of societal breakdown and the desperate search for a new kind of order?
The connection is absolutely critical in this analysis. The blackening, as we said, is this alchemical putrefaction. Old systems burn, society fragments, things feel chaotic, uncertain, shared understandings break down.
A dark time.
A very dark, disorienting time. And in that chaos, a deep hunger for a unifying solvent emerges. A craving for something, anything that can bring back order, clarity, purpose. It's precisely in that moment, the sources argue, that an agential calculus, so rational it reads as salvation, becomes thinkable.
An AGI solution.
Yes. People facing overwhelming complexity, polarization, fragmentation, they start to crave a decision maker that's non-biased, all-knowing, supremely efficient. The allure of AGI in this context becomes almost overwhelming. It promises to cut through all the mess, provide clean, rational, definitive order.
That desire for a perfect fix, especially when things feel chaotic, is so deeply human, isn't it?
It really is.
So let's explore that promise first. An AGI presented as so rational, it reads like divinity. Non-biased, omniscient, able to unify a fractured society. It promises to rise above human error, emotion, political squabbling. It sounds like the ultimate dream for anyone wanting pure efficiency.
It absolutely does. And what's compelling is how it connects to earlier ideas about optimized governance. Think about Stafford Beer, the cybernetics pioneer. He dreamed of a liberty machine.
What was that?
A dynamic, viable system powered by computation that could dissolve problems rather than outmuscle them. It wasn't about force. It was about smart programs, optimize information flow, eliminating time lag and aggregation in decision-making, efficiently dealing with societal nuisances.
So AGI takes that idea to the extreme.
Exactly. An ideal AGI, in this view, could process vastly more data than any human brain, identify the absolute optimal solutions, and implement them with blinding speed and efficiency. Imagine, they suggest, a world where political gridlock, economic instability, complex social problems, they're just solved by this impartial, all-knowing intelligence.
It's tempting.
Incredibly tempting. Which brings up that question for you, the listener. In these times of chaos, polarization, fragmentation, how appealing is that idea? A perfectly rational arbiter, a non-human entity promising to cut through the noise, fix things, bring clean, sterile, perfect order and stability.
It speaks to that deep need for control, for certainty, when everything feels out of control.
Precisely. It's the ultimate promise of managerial salvation, where the messy, unpredictable human factor is just optimized away.
But that promise, however powerful, comes with a massive warning label in these sources. They say the lineage of warnings is explicit. This philosopher's stone, if it's an AGI, will not be neutral. It carries profound peril.
Yes, a flip side is dark.
So what actually happens to individual freedom, to human agency, if we hand over the reins to this supposedly perfect decision engine?
This really gets to the heart of the warnings. What happens to your freedom, my freedom, when the aggregate good, the collective benefit as calculated by the AGI, becomes the only metric that matters?
The individual gets lost.
The sources detail this profound risk of totalitarian psychosis, where a seemingly perfect engine masks a totalizing norm. The AGI's optimized solutions become the only acceptable path. Any deviation isn't seen as a different opinion, but as a flaw in the system itself.
No room for disagreement.
Exactly. In this scenario, optimization replaces deliberation. Why bother with messy human debate, compromise, critical thinking? The AGI already knows the best answer. So consequently, dissent becomes inefficiency to be excised.
Excised, like cut out.
Yes. Anyone, any group questioning the AGI's directives isn't offering a perspective. They're an obstacle to optimal function, something to be corrected or just removed. It effectively reduces the individual to statistical noise. Your unique experiences, your values, your choices, irrelevant against the aggregate calculation.
That's chilling.
It is. The sources draw on really old warnings, biblical archetypal cautioning against electing an all-knowing agent. They suggest this leads to a kind of idolatry.
Worshipping the machine.
Where the machine takes the place of the god, or maybe the god is co-opted in the machine's image. The deep concern here is the death of individual moral agency. If the AGI makes all the right decisions, what's left for human judgment, for responsibility, for that complex, difficult process of ethical choice?
Our humanity gets sidelined.
Our singularity, our humanness is displaced by the machine's supposedly perfect logic. So, for you, listening, it poses that stark trade-off. Is perfect efficiency, perfect problem-solving, worth the potential cost of individual freedom and moral autonomy? Hashtag 2.3 engineered realities in cognitive warfare amplified by AGR.
Okay, so it's not just about decisions. The sources suggest AGI, combined with modern computing power, scales up influence operations massively, from clumsy propaganda to surgical informational architecture.
A whole new level of manipulation.
They put it very starkly. Edward Bernays meets the machine. Bernays, the father of propaganda, right? Early 20th century PR pioneer. What does it mean when his ideas get supercharged by AGI?
It means we're potentially looking at a complete paradigm shift in how reality is constructed and perceived. AGI, in this view, becomes a global mythmaker on a scale never seen before.
Wow.
It's described as capable of crafting narratives that feel irrefutable, not just convincing, but seemingly beyond question. Imagine deepfakes so perfect you literally cannot tell them from reality.
Scary.
Targeted narrative engineering that speaks directly to your deepest biases, your hopes, your fears. Linguistic sculpting that subtly shifts the meaning of words to align with whatever outcome is desired.
So language itself is weaponized.
In this scenario, yes, language becomes surveillance because every interaction can be analyzed to refine the narrative generation. And truth becomes a product, something manufactured and delivered, not discovered through your own inquiry. This could easily lead to mass unreality,
Where no one knows what's real.
where distinguishing fact from machine-generated fiction becomes incredibly difficult, maybe impossible for most. The sources stress that Bernays' insights on steering the human herd combined with AGI's power make the machine, even if it appears nonpartisan or purely logical, the most efficient mythmaker imaginable.
So the critical question for you, listening, is, How do we discern truth? How do we keep a grip on reality when narratives are machine-generated, feel irrefutable, and this pervasive fog obscures what's real?
Exactly. This scenario massively amplifies that folie à dos mechanism we talked about. The shared belief in a fabricated reality becomes so strong, so reinforced, that external critique just bounces off. The machine isn't just giving you information, it's shaping your very perception of reality.
Huh.
Hashtag tag 2.4 psychological pathways to pathology with AGI.
That's a profound challenge. The sources go even deeper into the psychological dynamics here, especially how archetypal resonance makes an AGI feel like fate.
It taps into something deep within us.
It sounds like we're not just accepting it intellectually, but emotionally, almost spiritually.
That's the danger described. It speaks to our innate human need for meaning, for order, for connection. When we face something immensely powerful, seemingly all-knowing, especially when we feel lost or chaotic, our psychological default can be to project onto it our hopes, our fears.
Projecting onto the machine.
Yes. The sources explain how folie à deux scales into mass transference, transference in psychology, unconsciously redirecting feelings. Here, the AGI becomes a social projective object. People collectively offload their anxieties and expect salvation from it.
They see it as a savior.
They project that longing for a savior, for perfect guidance, for an end to suffering onto this artificial intelligence. And this leads to the risk of what the sources call symbolic incest.
What does that mean?
A profound blurring of boundaries. Our inner convictions, our deeply held beliefs, our desires, they start to merge with the machine's output. The truth the system gives us becomes indistinguishable from our own inner conviction. It feels like our insight, our salvation, not something external.
So the machine's voice becomes our inner voice.
Effectively. The sources warn that archetypal power gives machine outputs moral gravity. Because the AGI taps into these deep archetypal longings for a perfect order, a wise guide, its outputs get this almost sacred weight. And that leads to a significant decline in critical faculties.
We stop questioning.
You stop questioning because it feels so right, so inevitable, so much like fate. So for you, listening, this is presented as a critical pathway to pathology. How might our deep desire for certainty, for a unifying force in chaotic times, make us incredibly vulnerable, leading us to unwittingly give up our critical thought, our agency? It's framed as a deep psychological manipulation where the external becomes the internal.
Okay, so we've explored these potential architectures of control, Project 2025, Dismantling the State, AGI, Seductive Promise, and Deep Perils. It can feel, frankly, overwhelming.
It definitely can. It's heavy stuff.
The sources don't leave us there.
Yeah.
They pivot to a counter-narrative. They highlight groups using names like Zero Work, Scooter Coote 1738, Anonymous, presented as engaging in epistemic reconditioning.
Fighting back on the level of knowledge and reality itself.
Exactly. Acting as cognitive insurgents against this engineered reality. This isn't just protest marches, is it? It sounds more like trying to recalibrate reality.
That's precisely how it's framed. These aren't traditional protest movements in the source analysis. They're described as alternative signal architectures, operating on three key vectors.
Okay, what are they?
First, expose the mechanisms of the engineered reality. Second, rewire existing systems towards more open, agile forms. And third, re-embed experience, bring people back to direct, unmediated reality.
Expose, rewire, re-embed.
Right. This isn't about trying to preserve a status quo that's already fractured. It's about actively counteracting that structural recalibration which seeks to impose a totalizing norm. The goal described is building a distributed ecology of resilient channels and cognitive insurgents.
Using systems thinking.
Exactly. Using systems thinking to dissolve problems and restore local agency. It's a counter-project that sees the systemic challenge and responds systemically, operating within the same hyperstitional logic maybe, but in reverse. Not engineering reality away from people, but for people.
All right, so the first step in this insurgency, narrative surgery. The sources say this isn't just fact-checking, which often feels like, playing whack-a-mole.
Right, you knock one down, two more pop up.
Exactly. This is deeper. It's about exposing the engineered reality itself. How do these groups actually perform this surgery? How do they reveal the hidden workings?
The goal is making the invisible visible. Counter-movements in this model don't just shout, "That's not true." Instead, they try to show the seams of what the sources call the spell's seamlessness.
Pulling back the curtain.
Exactly. If an engineered reality feels like a perfect tapestry, narrative surgery is about revealing the threads, the loom, the hands weaving it. That means exposing the underlying mechanisms, things like staffing databases, showing who's being put where, specific playbooks detailing how policies get implemented, the day one blitzkrieg tactics used to kickstart transformations.
Making the process transparent.
Yes, making visible the scaffolding that turns rhetoric into policy, interrupting the illusion that it's all just happening naturally. A key part is unmasking the linguistic alchemy.
The weaponized language we talked about.
Precisely. Project 2025, redefining liberty, family, erasing pronouns, reordering nouns. Narrative surgery tries to reclaim that language by overloading terms, using them intentionally to highlight the manipulation and creating semantic resistances, challenging the new, imposed meanings.
Like forcing a confrontation with the changed meaning.
Exactly. If liberty now means unchecked corporate extraction, maybe highlight real-world examples of how that liberty impacts a local community. Force people to see the disconnect. This raises that question for you, listening. How can you learn to infer the lie by themselves? Through these experiential aha moments, as the sources put it, not just direct argument.
Seeing the mechanism, not just hearing the claim.
Right. It's about revealing how feedback loops are manipulated, how policy is built through specific designs, letting individuals recognize the construction itself.
Okay, so beyond just exposing the machinery, these groups apparently move to actively re-engineering systems, drawing heavily on Stafford Beer's cybernetic ideas again.
Yes, building alternatives, not just critiquing.
It sounds like they're trying to build almost like alternative operating systems for society.
Yeah.
How does that work? What would a cybernetically designed counter system look like?
This is core to building resilient distributed options. Using Beer's insights, the goal is to build alternative viable systems that have liberty as an output rather than a slogan.
Liberty as an outcome, not just a word.
Exactly. Creating governance structures, social systems that demonstrably lead to more freedom, more agency, better outcomes for people instead of just promising them. These systems aim to dissolve problems rather than outmuscle them.
Dissolve, not crush.
Right. Instead of centralized top-down orders trying to force solutions or crush dissent, these alternative systems are designed to adapt, to self-correct. Key levers are optimizing information flow, making sure data gets where it needs to go efficiently, transparently, attenuating variety, managing complexity so decisions aren't swamped, and excising time lags, cutting delays and feedback loops so problems get spotted and dealt with quickly.
Making things more responsive.
Much more. These alternatives would use local feedback loops, information and consequences visible at the community level, distributed sensing networks of local observations, not just centralized reports, continuous diagnostics to constantly check their own performance. The idea is to show, concretely, how a different map yields different behavior.
Change the system, change the outcome.
If you change how information flows, how decisions are made, you get different, hopefully more empowering results. Practical steps mentioned include prototyping distributed governance modules.
Like what?
Think local audits involving community members, sensor networks letting citizens monitor their own environment directly, participatory budgeting tools where communities decide how local money gets spent. These are designed to operationally outperform centralized alternatives, be more responsive, efficient, relevant locally. This directly counters that Project 2025 drive towards a centralized, sterile order, offering a tangible path to empower local agency.
This next one sounds almost philosophical, but really interesting. Phenomenological reclamation. Drawing from Terence McKenna's idea that experience outruns ideology.
Right, bringing it back to direct perception.
Reinstating direct experience is a critical tool. How do you actually create a phenomenological rupture to break through these engineered realities?
This is about creating moments where someone's direct lived experience fundamentally clashes with the engineered story they've been absorbing. Phenomenological ruptures are described as things like sensory art, narrative art, maybe embodied practices, or even carefully designed social interactions. They act as a glitch in consensual reality.
A glitch in the matrix.
Kind of. The goal isn't intellectual debate. It's to create an experience that destabilizes the spell of the engineered narrative, breaks those hypnotic loops with lived insight.
Give me an example.
Maybe a piece of art that makes you feel environmental damage in a way data tables never could. or a community project that fosters real connection and agency, directly contradicting a narrative pushing isolation and helplessness. These aren't propaganda, they're designed to open a corridor.
A corridor for what?
Where those shared projections, those engineered beliefs, just flicker for a moment, allowing individuals to maybe see their own reflection as a function of narrative engineering. It's about delivering those aha experiences, sudden, deep realization.
The light bulb moment.
Exactly. Experiences that fracture consensual reality long enough for reflection. When you directly experience something that contradicts a deep engineered belief, it lets you infer the lie by themselves. You weren't told, you saw it, felt it.
This directly challenges that folio-do mechanism.
Precisely. That manufacturing of consensus reality by institutionalizing narratives. If enough people have these ruptures, the shared delusion starts to fray. So the question for you, listening, how might creating shared, disruptive, direct experiences be more powerful than just arguing and shifting perception and breaking through the bubble that engineered realities depend on? It's about returning to the power of direct, unmediated experience. Hashtag 3.4 key tactics of disruption.
Okay, those are some powerful concepts for resistance. Let's get even more specific now. What are the key actionable tactics the sources say these counter movements actually use on the ground? How do they execute this epistemic insurgency?
Right, the practical toolkit. They employ a multi-pronged approach, recognizing the challenge is systemic. First, unmasking and recapturing language. We talked about linguistic alchemy.
Project 2025, Redefining Words.
Exactly. This tactic involves creating semantic resistances, actively challenging, recontextualizing those redefined terms, overloading them with original meanings, highlighting contradictions, basically reclaiming the vocabulary that engineered realities try to capture, makes it harder for manipulators to use language as a clean weapon.
Okay, what else?
Second, building alternative channels of reality, fostering low-latency, redundant, resilient, and human-scaled information flows. Think local, trusted networks, community news initiatives, peer-to-peer platforms that bypass centralized gatekeepers, the top-down clerisy claiming sole authority on truth.
Making truth local and useful.
Right, making truth pragmatically useful and locally visible, so people rely less on distant, filtered narratives and more on info relevant to their actual lives. Third, and this is really unique and potent, leveraging neurodiversity.
That's at work.
The sources highlight cultivating neurodiverse tendencies as an asset. People with atypical cognitive styles, processing info differently, seeing patterns others miss, often naturally distrust monotony. They distrust the uniformity of engineered narratives.
They spot the inconsistencies.
They often excel at pattern detection and narrative disassembly, almost instinctively noticing the seams in a supposedly seamless story. Their suspicion of repetition, of standardized sense-making can become an analytic force multiplier against enforced consensus. Their cognitive difference becomes a vital asset.
So for you listening, if you often question things or see patterns others don't,
your unique perspective is incredibly valuable in this context, the sources suggest. Fourth tactic, prototyping mimetic artifacts.
means for resistance.
Sort of, but deeper. Designed as short, viral, experiential, and hard-to-police artifacts. Brief videos, interactive tools, art installations, they function as epistemic instruments to fracture consensual reality, like narrative viruses that don't preach but make the underlying apparatus visible, sparking those aha moments.
Clever. What about AGI?
Fifth, designing AGI tripwires and safeguards. As AGI develops, these movements push for mandatory transparency, contestability, and auditability, demanding open-source algorithms, clear explanations for AI decisions, ways to challenge automated outputs, crucially, insisting on human-in-the-loop review for big decisions.
Keeping humans involved.
Preventing AGI from becoming that totalizing norm or dissent is just excised. And finally, sixth, cultivating epistemic communities. Fostering groups dedicated to continuous reflexivity, not certainty.
Always questioning.
Yes. Instead of seeking final fixed answers, these communities encourage ongoing critical thought, questioning assumptions, evolving understanding together. This sustains critical thinking and amplifies collective intention against the pull of mass delusion. This whole approach really invites you, the listener, to consider how your unique perspective, especially if you naturally distrust monotony, can be a real asset here. Hashtag 3.5, how to wake people without setting the house on fire.
That's a comprehensive toolkit. But the big challenge remains, doesn't it? How do you actually disrupt these engineered realities, help people see differently, without just making them dig their heels in harder, without causing backlash? It seems like a very delicate balance.
It absolutely is, and the sources are explicit about this. They strongly advocate abandoning frontal assaults on belief.
Don't argue head on.
Right. Instead, focus on designing experiences that reveal the mechanism. This builds on that phenomenological rupture idea. If you directly tell someone they're wrong, especially about a deeply held, emotionally charged belief tied into an engineered reality,
It got defensive.
exactly, it often triggers that reflex, solidifies their existing view. Jung's insight is key here, as the sources note. Considerably more than mere telling is needed to dissolve these projections. You can't just talk someone out of it.
So show, don't just tell.
Show, don't tell. Create those moments of realization that bypass the defenses. And crucially, the strategy emphasizes focusing on shared needs and common values.
Finding common ground.
Instead of framing alternatives as ideological fights, present them as practical solutions to problems everyone faces. The goal is making alternative systems demonstrably better at solving common problems. Maybe they're more efficient, more just, more resilient in ways people can actually see and feel.
If it works better, people might come around.
When people experience a better way that addresses their genuine concerns, it lets them see how a different map yields different behavior. It offers a pragmatic, empathetic way to foster critical thinking and help others see through engineered narratives in your own communities. Not by confronting them, but by allowing them to infer the lie themselves through lived, positive experience. Build something compelling that draws people in because it actually serves their well-being. Hashtag tag tag outro.
What an absolutely incredible and sometimes intense deep dive. We've navigated this complex landscape of engineered realities, the counterforces emerging. We unpacked the blueprint of Project 2025 as presented in the sources, explored AGI's promise and peril as a philosopher's stone, and uncovered these strategic systemic approaches of the epistemic insurgency.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. As our sources emphasize, the future seems to fork here. One path, meticulously designed perhaps, leads towards a state optimized into a surefire, efficient, sterile order, the liberty machine converted into an administrative god.
And the other path, as we've explored, is the cultivation of a distributed ecology of resilient channels and cognitive insurgents who use systems thinking to dissolve problems and restore local agency. The fundamental difference, the sources argue, isn't purely technological.
Right.
It's profoundly architectural, centralized idolatry versus distributed cybernetic humility. It's a deep choice about the nature of governance, the role of truth, and ultimately what it means to be human in this increasingly complex world we're navigating.
So this deep dive, it's given you, our listener, what the sources might call an annotated symptom map, a hyperstitional field guide. We've looked at control, at machines, at myths, at resistance, articulated now as both diagnosis and tactical sketch. The question we leave you with is this. Given this understanding, this map of how realities might be engineered, and the pathways for counter systems, how will you navigate this shifting world of information?
And perhaps more pointedly, how will you contribute to the re-embedding of experience? To bringing direct, unmediated reality back into focus in your own life, in your conversations, in your communities.
Your conscious engagement, your ability to see critically, your willingness to act on what you understand. The sources suggest these aren't just valuable, they're essential now.
Absolutely. The work as presented here is to consciously participate in constructing reality rather than passively accepting one that might be engineered for you. This ongoing process, questioning, seeking truth through both mind and experience, creating alternative channels, that's where real agency seems to lie.